Okay.
We're going to do the intermission too.
Yes, yeah. So, do you want to make a note? Do you want to keep an eye on it, or do you want me to give you a one?
Do you have a nice break?
Yep. Do you want to double check the sounds working?
Yeah.
Do you want me to give you a wind up, or you?
No, I'll be right.
You'll be right.
So,
45.
Yeah, so 7:15 I finish. Is that right?
Yeah.
And then 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And then wouldn't that take me? Then the second part won't be 45 minutes.
No, but it wasn't last time either. It was an hour and 20 altogether. So there's 10, 15 minutes for questions. If you need.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay, let's just make sure this is working. All right.
She's like trained.
Are you good to control it from keyboard?
Yep.
So you should just be able to.
Okay. Great.
Camera is. Can you see where you're centered?
Yep.
Oh no.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Yagara and Turrbal people. Acknowledge that learning has gone on this place for millennia. Thank you so much for coming to the QSCP seminar series on Žižek this evening. This is the second seminar that we're running. Just before we get started, I just wanted to let you know that the toilets are down the hall to our left, and in the case of an emergency, we just run for the stairs out the door as well. I looked at the diagram and I think I'm reading it correctly. So tonight we are hearing the second in a series of 6 seminars presented by Dr. Chris Boredom on the philosophy of Žižek, or the thought of Žižek. Last week we looked at Žižek's ontology, and the resources from that session are up on our website, qscp.net. Tonight the presentation is on the death drive. There'll be an intermission after 45 minutes, so we can have just a little bit of a break, and then the seminar will continue, and there'll be time for questions at the end. As per last week, there is a document with quotes, relevant quotes, that's been distributed, and that's also online. And without further ado, I will throw over to Dr. Chris Boredom for Žižek's The Death Drive.
Okay, good evening, everybody. So what I'm going to start with is the end of the first session. So the notes that I've given you for the lesson on the death drive. What I'm going to start with doing, though, is going through the critical responses to Žižek's dialectical materialism. Now, the reason I think that's important is because last session I went over what the dialectical materialism is. It's the basic idea behind it, and I found one of the best ways to try to get clear about what Žižek is actually claiming is to compare it to what are the alternatives, what are the other ways of conceptualizing ontology, what is there. So I'm going to start with that, and then we're going to get into Freudian death drive. And the reason that I'm doing a whole session on the death drive is because as I was reading Žižek, the death drive just came up as this all-important concept. It came up again and again. It wasn't something I planned at the start of my PhD project. It wasn't a plan that I really need to focus on the death drive. I thought it'd be like a footnote, but it turned into a whole chapter. It's just very strange. I mean, when you think of I guess we call the stereotypical idea of the death drive, it's that human beings have this, that yes, we have a pleasure principle, we seek pleasure, but then we also have this destructive principle where we seek destruction and we seek to destroy ourselves. And obviously Žižek has a very different reading of the death drive, and but it's such an important concept because when you grasp it, it makes everything else that follows. So that's his conception of freedom, his conception of ethics, even his politics. All of it really comes down or comes from his conception of the death drive. So it is actually crucially important. once you've got his idea of the subject and you see how he uses the depth drive to elaborate on that or to theorize that, then everything else it'll make all the other sessions make sense. So just quickly, what was this dialectical materialism? It's an attempt to think subject and substance. It's a Lacanian rereading of Hegel. It's the idea that every objective reality is subjectively mediated. And rather than seeing the subject and object as separate, the subject is that which incompletes objective reality. If you like, the subject is the object. That means the objective reality can't be finished, right? And the other key thing is that rather that what is there is appearances, and it's thinking through the fact that that any attempt to grasp the whole of reality is always going to involve incompleteness, and that incompleteness is the subject, and we have to think that incompleteness and that contradiction to think what is there, to think ontology. So the axiom of true materialism is that there is nothing which is not material reality, but material reality is incomplete. It's not all. And what renders it incomplete is the subject. So now let's look at some alternatives. So first of all, we could look at very straightforward scientific materialism. So, and this one I guess would be I don't know, I'm probably very erroneously going to call it like a common sense scientific way of grasping what's there. There is and that would be like the materialism that says we can explain what's there using science. So you think of like Darwinism as a means of explaining why human beings do what they do, or brain sciences. And that would be that everything can sort of be accounted for using our scientific understanding of the world. And that's often contrasted with discursive materialism. And you can think of here also Freudian historicism, right? So this is the idea that, in fact, everything that we understand is always an effective discourse. So that's like a radical culturalization. In fact, it's not that. So whereas scientific materialism says, oh no, what's there is just material reality, and we can explain everything by reducing it to just what's there in terms of material practices. Discursive materialism says, no, all that's there is discourse, and anything we understand is always filtered through discourse. Žižek actually argues these two materialisms are two sides of the same coin. What they are both doing is repressing the subject. Scientific naturalism does it by saying, well, what we call the subject is just an effect of, say, brain states, material states, and it's actually reducible to those things. And discursive materialism says what we call the subject is just an effect of words. It's an effect of culturally affected, as in culturally brought about discourses. And Žižek's reply to both of those is that they both end up in performative contradiction. So that's how we criticize either of both approaches. If you try to claim, and we're going to come up with this idea of performative contradiction a lot. All it means is that in trying to make the claim, in the very act of making the claim, you're contradicting the claim that you're making. So in the simple things like in scientific naturalism, one example would be a book I read recently, which was, I forget the name of the book, but it was a scientist basically claiming that because of evolution, we don't see the world as it is. We'll never see the world accurately. Now, there's an obvious performative contradiction in making that claim, because if it's the case that evolution has caused us to not be able to see the world accurately, then how is it possible that you have managed to see that we cannot see the world accurately? How have you managed to outsmart that evolutionary process and come up with this true understanding of our inability to see the world? So, or if you're just going to say, well, I'm nothing more than all I am is a series of brain states, and that I'm not a self, and so on, then a series of brain states can't do something like make an argument or make decisions about what they believe and don't believe. So in the very act of making a claim that you want other people, that you're willing to defend, you're implying that you in fact are something other than the object that you're claiming that you are. And in the case of discursive materialism, look, we just have the problem again of, if any statement that you make, you always have the subject is always the thing that's making the statement. So we discussed this last week. If I make the claim, say that I am Chris, that enunciated content, the actual statement there, only functions if I'm implying that there's some X, some thing that's carrying that, that's able to carry that identity. And that's the thing that is that you can never enunciate. So no matter how much discourse you develop to sort of explain what you are, develop an idea of the subject, you're always going to miss the subject, because the subject is always that thing that's involved in making those claims. Okay, And then we move on to object-oriented ontologies. And Harman here, so Harman is one of the, he's a big proponent of object-oriented ontologies. And that's basically the ontology is that what exists are objects. So everything's an object. And that's the basic starting point of what is there. In book, Harman argues that Žižek's philosophy is problematic for these reasons, because it reduces all relations between inanimate objects to conditions by which humans witness those relations. And he wants to argue that that really leaves out a lot, because it means that we can't think about how objects relate to other objects when human beings aren't around. So while philosophy is charged with knowing the whole of reality, the philosophy of access, which is his name for Žižek's, or philosophies like Žižek's, reduces that reality to the tiny portion of it directly available to humans. And in this way, it exhibits inadequacy and sows the seeds of its own eventual abandonment. And there's a lot of these, the new materialist ontologies are all about trying to get rid of an anthropocentric idea of reality. So trying to stop thinking of human beings as being relative to or at the center of what is there, and thinking the world as in a way that doesn't involve any sort of human perspective. And so he says that's why this sort of philosophy of access doesn't work. Žižek's reply to this, and this is important. So Žižek's ontology doesn't claim that what exists, say, independently of a human being, is ontologically reliant on human subjectivity or perception. So the claim that does Žižek believe in an external world that would still exist for subjects didn't exist? The answer is yes, he does. There is an external world that's that would. So we can imagine, for instance, if human beings all suddenly stopped existing, this room would still exist. The the space downstairs would still exist. It would all still be there, and we can imagine what would happen as we continue not existing and so on. But here's the thing. So, but it is epistemologically reliant on a subject. So if you want to know what that world is like that's existing without human beings, well, then you've got the subject back in. So let's say you want to imagine this room as it would exist without a human being. You can do that, and it's a coherent concept to imagine it existing without anyone watching it, without a subject. But in the very act of imagining that world that exists without a subject, there's still a subjective perception perspective there, because you're now imagining yourself as, say, when you're imagining the room that's existing without anyone there, you're imagining yourself in some position in relation to that room. You're still imagining it as a room. Another way of putting this would be, what is actually here at the moment is not chairs and tables. I mean, another way of looking at this world would be, well, what's here is actually a series of atoms, which we can't perceive because they're too small, but they're there. So that's a reality that is just as much a part of calling this a room as saying, well, and also its chairs and desks and so on. So if you want to say, well, would the room exist without a human subject? The answer is yes. Well, of course it would. It's not ontologically reliant on the subject. It's not like when you take the subject out, all of a sudden everything disappears. But as a room, if you want to think of it as a room, then when you've taken all those human beings out of it, you're still imagining that there's some subject there watching it. Another way of making this point would be, if I ask you to imagine it's a bit depressing, but let's ask you now to imagine your own funeral. You do so. I'm sure there's lots of people there. Did anyone, though, actually imagine themselves in the coffin? See how straight away you imagine the world when you're not there, you're still there, but you're there as a subject that's like in an empty way observing the world. So that's the sense in which the subject is still in that world even when you're not there. You're still there as a subject when you imagine that world when you're absent. So that's sort of a point that sort of making in reply to sort of the object, these criticisms of object-oriented ontology to Žižek, when they say, well, you're making this claim that reality is dependent on human beings. It's like, no, you can think of reality that doesn't involve human beings. What you can't do is think that when you're knowing that reality that doesn't have human beings, you've actually got rid of the subject. There's still a subject there. Okay. I'm going to talk about Mesa in a moment, where I'll make the same point, so it'll hopefully be clearer then. And this is Japanchik's reply to, which I think is really clear as well to this problem. That the problem is not simply that we can never exempt ourselves from reality of which we are a part, and that we cannot reflexively subtract our distortion in this way obtain pure independent reality. The problem is deeper and much more fundamental. Reality as it is independently of ourselves appears only dependent on us as subjects. And this is the key point. Not in the sense of being caused or constituted by us. It's not that we cause that reality to happen, but in the sense that reality's own inherent negativity contradiction appears as part of this reality. That is, if we want to pretend we don't exist anymore and the room's still here, okay, but you still don't imagine the complete room. When you think of that room that is losing any human beings, there's still gaps. The subject is still there. So that's object-oriented ontology. Now, Quinton Mayasu, and here, okay, so Quinton Mayasu writes After Finitude in 2008. Žižek endorses this book. I mean, he's quoted on the front cover saying, "This is a brilliant book. I love it." So when he read about correlationism, Žižek didn't really, I don't think he picked up anything saying, "Oh, gee, this is a problem for me," and what I've been saying at all. And in his mind, I imagine Žižek was thinking, this person is going against Kant. He's pushing beyond Kant. He does it in a slightly different way from me, but I also am pushing beyond Kant. So we both have similar projects. But Mayasu later came out in the interview with Harman, who we just looked at, and said, no, Žižek's ontology has this wobbly subject, and so it's still correlationist. And and then Žižek responded to that in less than nothing. So Quinton Mayasu's argument is against correlationism. That's how he defines correlationism, the idea according to which we only ever have access to the correlation between thinking and being, and never to either term considered apart from the other. So Mayasu uses the term archifossil and correlation to refer to things that existed before there were any human beings to know them, and ancestral statements refer to statements about archifossils. So the one that he uses in After Finitude, which is really easy one to use, is the Earth accretized, like the Earth formed, I think it's like 4 billion years ago. So that's a statement about something that happened, but it's a statement about an archifossil. It's a statement about, it's an ancestral statement because there's no one was around to observe the Earth forming there 4 billion years ago. So Mayasu's argument is, if you want to claim that the ancestral statement is true, so if you want to say it is true that the Earth formed 4 billion years ago, even though there was no one there to see it, then you can't make that claim if you're a correlationist unless you're going to put in an implicit, unless you're going to qualify it and say that according to from our subjective point of view. And his point is that that's just a nonsense. Like, the statement is true, it happened, it's not an impossible event, and therefore that shows that we must admit that there are things that existed independently of a subject. Or it's more subtle than that. It's more that if you're a correlationist, you can't claim to be a realist. That any realist statement you're making about an ancestral statement, you're implicitly making this right as saying according to some subject. Okay. And this is Mayasu criticizing Žižek. So he says, unless we fall back on naive realism, which would be saying that, look, the Earth just formed then, and we don't need a subject to say that it did, we cannot treat these misfires as effects of a cause that could definitely be established as external to the subject or even to consciousness. When one clogs up the subject, one does not go outside it. Instead, one merely constructs a transcendental or speculative wobbly subject. That's what Žižek is doing. A subject goes ashore a priori, and according to a probably absolute knowing, for which things always turn badly in its world of representations. So he calls Žižek not a correlationist, but a misfired correlationism. So he says that Žižek basically is still stuck in this world where you can't talk about objects without the subject. Sorry, I should have said that's cited in Harman. So this is an interview Mayasu did with Harman, and that's why it's the references to Harman. Okay. So this is Žižek's reply to Mayasu. Look, I'll read through Žižek's reply, but here's a simple way to explain why the ancestral statement doesn't get rid of the subject, right? And it's the same point I made before about the room, if you imagine everyone leaving. So you have this statement, the Earth formed 4 billion years ago. But there's, you can move to a position of space in the current universe that's 4 billion light years away. If you were looking at the Earth from that point in space, the Earth did not form 4 billion years ago. It would be forming right now. From that point in the universe, that's what you'd observe, right? So it still matters where you think the subject. when you say the Earth formed 4 billion years ago, what you're doing is, if we imagine, relative to basically where we are in the universe, and if you imagine you're sort of hovering outside the Earth looking at it, and then you would see the Earth forming 4 billion years ago. The actual objective claim still has with it this implicit appeal to some subjective that's constituting that world, so that we have an image of the Earth being formed. There's something really problematic about saying, oh, the Earth formed 4 billion years ago, when we know that things like time, factually, so scientifically, they're very relative. Where things are happening depends on where you're imagining the point of subjective description. So this was Žižek's reply. So he says the problem is not, and his argument is basically, look, Mayasu thinks he's going beyond Kant, but really he's, by saying that there's this in itself that appears separately from the subject, he's basically going back to the phenomenal noumenal distinction. And he says the problem is not, can we penetrate the veil of subjectively constituted phenomena of things in themselves, but how do phenomena themselves arise within the flat stupidity of reality, which just is? How does reality redouble itself and start to appear to itself? And you can see then that's the same move from Kant to Hegel. So he's sort of saying, yeah, but the problem isn't, can we grasp the world separate from a human perception and grasp what's there? The problem is, why is the world appearing at all? What must the world be for the world to appear in the first place? And you only get that if you have something like the subject. And even if you're imagining the world forming 4 billion years ago, you have to have some point of, that's still a type of appeal. Another way of saying it is that you can definitely think of the world that doesn't exist without human beings. It's not because it's not ontologically, the world isn't ontologically dependent on the subject. But to know that world or to have any ideas of that world, then you're going to have some point of transcendental subjective description. And yes, and again, the point that Žižek wants to make here is that any idea that you have of reality is always going to have those irreducible discord, non-correlation between subject and reality. So for order the subject to emerge, the impossible object that is subject must be excluded from reality, since it is this very exclusion which opens up the space for the subject. The problem is not to think the real outside of the transcendental correlation, which is what Mays is trying to do when he thinks of the Earth forming without anyone being there to see it. The problem is to think the real inside the subject, the hardcore of the real in the very heart of its subject, its extimate center, which is another way of saying, the object R, the way that subjective thing is like a stain you can never remove or get rid of in reality. That any idea you have of reality is always going to be partial and incomplete. And this is just from Peter Howland. So that distinction between epistemological versus ontological correlation, it's actually probably one of the main problems with Mayer's argument, is in that his definition of correlationism is ambiguous in terms of whether he means epistemological correlation or ontological correlation. So an ontological correlation would be, oh, well, for things to exist at all, there must be some subject. That there's no such thing as an external world that has no subject. Whereas I would argue Žižek is more an epistemological correlationist, that for the world to be known, that there must be some subject. If you're an epistemological correlationist, the example of the ancestral statement isn't a problem for you. It's like you're saying, no, I know things exist independently of me. I know the Earth formed when no one was there to see it. But if I'm going to know that the Earth formed, if that's going to be part of my knowledge of the Earth, then there must be some subjectivity involved. How can you know something if there's nothing doing any knowing? So that's just a useful distinction that I found. Yes. So the point would be, and so this is just from the conclusion of Žižek's response to Mayasu. So we should remember how relative external reality is with regard to our point of view, which does not mean we created it, the same as the Panchik point. I'm not claiming the subject makes reality, but that out of the infinite complexity of the real in itself, a part or slice of reality was selected as correlative to our perceptual apparatus. So we cannot ever escape the circle. The reality of a fossil is objective insofar as it is observed from our standpoint, in the same way that a rainbow objectively exists from our standpoint. What objectively exists is the entire field of interaction between subject and object as part of the real. So to reply to the ancestral statement, again, that Hegelian shift would be saying that very part of the reality of the Earth forming is our knowledge of the Earth forming. And that is part of what that object, that's part of what that is. And you can make that claim without sort of without going and saying there's no such thing as a reality that exists external to human beings. You can still be a realist, I think. Okay, and on to the vitalists. So this is a really, just a quote that Žižek has done a couple of times of a type of new Deleuzean vitalism. So this isn't Deleuze, but it's just from a book by Bennett on where she puts forward like the Nicene Creed for would-be materialists. And so this is where again you try to think of materialism, but in a way that really humbles the human subject. So you try to get rid of the subject by saying we need to appreciate that we're just one part of this infinite complexity of being, and stop trying to be, get rid of human exceptionalism and get rid of that anthropocentric view of the world. So I believe in one matter energy, the maker of things seen and unseen. I believe that this pluriverse is traversed by heterogeneities that are continually doing things. I believe that it is wrong to deny vitality to non-human bodies, forces, and forms, and that a careful course of anthropomorphization can help reveal that vitality, even though it resists full translation and exceeds my reveal that vitality, even though it resists full translation and exceeds my comprehensive grasp. I believe that encounters with lively matter can chasten my fantasies of human mastery, highlight the common materiality of all that is, and expose a wider distribution of agency and reshape the self and interests. We talked about this a little bit last week with this, part of this sort of new materialism is trying to think of the human being as just another object in the field of objects. And again, we come back to the same thing that for Žižek, this involves this performative contradiction. So it still relies on implicit subject framing. So Žižek just asked the question, if you're asking us to engage in a careful course of anthropocentrism to rid ourselves of human exceptionalism, is this something that I'm choosing to do, or am I doing it as just part of this asubjective vital force that you're talking about? So the very act of appealing to someone to say you need to get rid of your anthropocentrism is appealing to an ethical subject that can choose whether or not to go through with that course of anthropomorphism. Another example of this would be so I was listening to Naomi Klein's book today on doppelganger, and there was an example there where she spoke about a person who he was working along the Great Barrier Reef, and he talked about his journey in trying to not think of himself as something that's separated from nature. So it's just another part of the natural world, and said he wanted almost like to actually just become one with the nature around him, like with the coral and so forth. And the problem with that is that you can only go so far. You just can't get rid of the subject in the end. So it's that the problem at the end is that a piece of coral, I guess he's worried about global warming. If you just become like a piece of coral, then global warming is just going to be something that happens to you. It's not something which you're going to feel like as a human being you should be taking responsibility for or affecting change. To have that idea of some sort of ethical capacity to do something other than just let things happen to you, you have to have this idea of a subject. Yes. So now that's not to say that ethic is flat out wrong, or that you shouldn't, you should believe in human exceptionalism. Not at all. The point is that what you can't do is pretend that if you're going to make the claim that I'm just going to become one with these vitalist forces, in the act of making that very claim, there's still this residual effect of the subject there that you can't remove. So yes, there's definitely arguments to be made against the arrogance of human exceptionalism and thinking that human beings can control everything. Lots of problematic ideas there. What you can't, but in the very act of criticizing that, you can't go so far as to say, and so we just need to become another object and that will solve the problem. Because if you just become another object, you're no longer doing anything. You're no longer something that's making a choice at all. And so in a way you're not anymore becoming an object. So these ambiguities demonstrate the very possibility of divesting either of a materialist or a realist inquiry from subjectivity for such visions of a democracy of objects in which all objects, including the subject, occupy the same ontological standing possible only from the standpoint of the empty subject. So that's again the idea, you can't get rid of this stain of the subject. Every quest for direct access to subjectless objects that ignores or bypasses this cut or wound that is the subject already has to rely on reality's transcendental constitution. For the very heteroverse or pluriverse of actants posited by those in search of a finally subjectless object is itself formed by a certain transcendental vision of reality. So the problem with subjectless objects is it's not that they're too objective, neglecting the role of the subject, but that what they describe as a subjectless world of objects is already too subjective. So the point is there that, you know, the problem is not so much that you're getting is that it's too objective because you've got rid of the subject. The problem is even in getting rid of the subject, you'll still make this, that's still subjectively framed. The subject's still involved in there. You haven't actually gotten rid of it. And so you're, again, you're caught up in that, in that performative contradiction. Okay. And I think that, so this is, hopefully that helps clarify Žižek's position in terms of how his position is different from those, some other options. So against scientific reductionism, which says that everything that happens is just an effect of material causes, Žižek would say, yeah, it's true, there is nothing other than the material, but what you're missing is the negativity or the non-all nature of that material world. And what that means is that you're imagining this completed natural order in which everything's determined. That's just a fiction. Like that doesn't exist. And the big problem then is that you lose those ideas of freedom, love, and ethical responsibility. All those things which we'll see become really important for Žižek, but not in the ways in which they're normally thought, obviously. So against discursive materialism, the idea that everything's just discourse, what that misses is that that discourse also, language is always also incomplete because it involves those points of subjective description. There's always that point in language of the subject that can't be colonized by language. Against any sort of idealist obscurity, so we didn't go through this one, but he's also against any sort of idea that, there is something other than the material that would explain the material. So if I begin to appeal to a God or a transcendent principle, or I'm not sure this would be counted, but if you appeal to something like mind, you sort of, to solve the mind-body problem, you sort of just say, mind is just in everything. Those sorts of positions he sees as obscurantist. So he'd say, no, there's nothing other than material substance. There's nothing transcendent. There's just absences. Against object-oriented ontologies, it's like you can't, again, he sort of says, look, if you're going to say that what exists are just objects and human beings are just objects, that's fine. You can make that claim, but just appreciate you're still within the subjective horizon to make that claim. So the subject is still there. And against Deleuzean vitalism, ultimately there he's like saying that if you're going to claim that you're going to become one with this life force and the heterogeneities, or what Deleuze was about, deterritorialization, in putting forward that ethic, you've still got the real of the subject there. So putting forward an ethic of no longer being an ethical subject is still an ethic. You just can't get rid of it. So that sort of, hopefully that helps frame how Žižek is different from other people. Okay, now I think it's my favorite picture of Žižek I've found so far. We're now going to have a look at the death drive. And I'll start to introduce this now before we take our break. So when we think of Žižek's take on the death drive, you actually have to think of the undead. And Žižek does refer to zombies here. So so there's an opposite to being alive, which is dead. So you have that opposition, alive and dead. The undead is something else again. It's like when you like negate the death. So not dead is not the same as alive. It's undead. And being undead is like this type of living death, something that persists with no purpose, no goals. A word that's used a lot is acephalous, which just means headless. Now, if you can grasp this idea of something persisting on its own without anything to push it other than its own insistence on its course of action, you've basically grasped Žižek's idea of the death drive and what it is. And what I'm going to take you through now, though, to get to that, is where it comes from, looking at Freud, and then how that he relates that to the subjectivity of German idealism. And this is just a quote from the interview that this is why, when I first read this, I was so confused. So I want to share that confusion with you now. And this is like Žižek saying what really interests him back in 2004. This is what really interests me. If you look at the very core of psychoanalytical theory, of which even Freud was not aware, it's properly read death drive. Now, first of all, it's like, what do you mean Freud wasn't aware of the death drive? He created the concept. That's a weird thing to say. This idea of beyond the pleasure principle, the only way to read this properly is to read against the background of the notion of subjectivity as self-relating negativity in German idealism. I didn't quite know what that meant there, but it's like, what are you talking about? The only way to understand this Freudian concept of the death drive, which you said Freud didn't even understand, is to actually read it against this background is completely other philosophical tradition, which is, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. And that is to say, I just take literally Lacan's indication that the subject of psychoanalysis is the Cartesian cogito. Of course, I would add, as reread by Kant, Schelling, and Hegel, I am here very old-fashioned. And that just really confused, like that's just so confusing. But Žižek's talking about it is like, oh yeah, it's just obvious. Like this is what really interests me, just this basic idea. But when you begin to unpack all that, it really just comes down to, and that's what makes this is the order in which we're basically going to do it. We're going to look at Freud, then look at the German idealists, and then come back to and the cogito, and then just come back to okay, and then how does that relate to his ontology? I wanted to put that up there to sort of show you this is such a central concept for him, though. So some questions that we could have at the start as we begin to explore this is, the obvious thing, isn't death drive just a drive for humanity to seek destruction? Like the story, when I first came across the death drive, someone explained it to me as, yeah, so Freud was working with a lot of hysterics and people repressing things. Then World War I happened, and Freud was like, everyone's just killing each other, and there's so much horror and so much death. There must be something driving human beings other than just the pleasure principle. We must also be driven by this other instinct, a death instinct, an instinct to destroy and to destroy ourselves. And that obviously doesn't relate at all to the cogito or to German idealist theory of subjectivity. So that's definitely not what Žižek's talking about. But Žižek coming forward and saying, oh yeah, death drive, really important, especially if you read it through the perspective of Hegel, you can see why I was really confused when I first read this. And what are you talking about, like death drive and the cogito? The cogito is just like that gesture of Descartes of doubting everything. But what's one thing I can't doubt? Well, I can't think that I exist. I think therefore I am. That's the cogito. What's that got to do with the death drive? He wasn't trying to kill himself. He was just trying to doubt everything, trying to find the one thing he couldn't doubt. And then what is the German idealist reading of the cogito? I didn't know what that was then either. So when we unpack those things, though, hopefully it'll become clearer. So we're going to move on to the Freudian death drive. And I just wanted to point out, this is just something, I was looking up images of the death drive and I just clicked on this thing from Psychology Today. And I just thought it'd be good to start with so that we know what the death drive is not. So at least according to Žižek. So Freud proposed that humans have a life instinct and a death instinct. His theory was based on these drives, sex and aggression, dominating our lives. The drive for aggression is an external representation of the death drive. The death drive seeks destruction, life's return to an inorganic state. In some cases, this aggressive drive is directed inwards, resulting in suicide. In many countries during the times of war, suicide rates drop. In some countries, when homicide rates are low, suicide rates rise and vice versa. Interpretation of this data lends itself to the belief in an innate drive that compels balance in destructive forces. Okay, so we're going to look at why. So the key thing that's wrong with that from a Žižekian perspective is that, and probably from a Lacanian perspective as well, is that no, there aren't two different instincts. There aren't two different drives. Death drive is just another name for the and as we'll see, the death drive is in a way underpins all of life. It underpins the pleasure principle. It's not something that sits alongside of it. But also, this just amazed me. I mean, this is one of those things. It's like, so the idea that then you can see these two drives as leading to some sort of mechanism by which human populations are balanced out. It's like, if you have a population where there's not enough death happening, human beings step up and just start killing themselves or killing others to make sure there's enough. It's like, and where did you get that from? Like it's just one of those weird things. It's like, oh, we've got some data, so we're going to use that to sort of prop up this really simplistic visual of the world. I just thought that was funny. Anyway, so we're going to start with 3 essays on sexuality. And so this is where Freud first introduces the idea of drive. And one of the key theses of like 3 essays on sexuality is that I don't know what you would call it, what conservative society would say is proper sexual activity is actually still perverse. So let's say we establish a definition of perverse sexual behavior as anything that is not sex for heterosexual reproduction. So if there's heterosexual sex and there's reproduction happening, that's normal sex, and everything else is perverse sex. Freud says, listen, if that's your definition, then I'm sorry, everything is, the perverse sex is everywhere. And he just sort of says, because, I mean, what's kissing? And we do have to read this definition of kissing. Yeah. I might just read that last bit. This point is that moreover the kiss, one particular contact of the kind between the mucous membrane of the lips of the two people concerned, is held in high sexual esteem among many nations, in spite of the fact that the parts of the body involved do not form part of the sexual apparatus, but constitute the entrance to the digestive tract. So that's a good point. So you have this act which might, that, you know, your average conservative person who would say, you know, there's only one type of proper sex, heterosexual sex for reproduction. It's like, but kissing's okay, right? Kissing, yeah, that's fine. Which seems to be part of sexuality. It'd be hard to say, you know, typical kissing is not sexual. So okay, so that's perverse then, because that's got nothing to do with reproduction. It's just, you're just joining the mucous membranes of two digestive tracts. That's, yeah. And you can think of that for many cases, for sort of becomes the idea of human sexuality in general. Like Freud points out that the key thing about human sexuality seems to be that it diverges from what you could call a natural, instinctual thing where sex is something that just happens through reproduction. Rather, what seems to happen is that sexuality gets tied up with all these drives where we become attached to an activity which isn't directly related to sex, but which is still sexual. Things like kissing or touching and so on. The example that Žižek uses is if, you know, you're introduced to someone new and they shake your hand and they just continue to shake it and they won't let go, that action itself suddenly becomes sexual. It's like, what's going on? Like, what's this repetitive attachment that is just going on for its own sake? So Freud describes the drives as emerging from a purposeful instinctual action, which then generates an enjoyment that causes a purposeless, repetitive engagement in an action for its own sake. So an example here is thumb sucking, which we can follow as an example of the drive. So you have an instinctual action. A child sucks on the breast to attain nourishment, but the pleasure of sucking on an object generates an excessive enjoyment, which is not about gaining nutrients. So the enjoyment that the child gets out of sucking is not a necessary part of the actual the process of getting nutrition. And then what happens is the child begins to engage in that action for its own sake. So the child starts to suck their thumb for the sake of enjoyment, an action which doesn't have any nutritional benefits, and which is sort of just continues for this purposeless, repetitive action, which is just all about enjoyment and doesn't achieve any purpose anymore. So, and that's just about this thumb sucking. So it's clear that the behavior of a child who indulges in thumb sucking is determined by a search for some pleasure, which has already been experienced and is now remembered. In the simplest case, he proceeds to find the satisfaction by sucking rhythmically at some part of the skin or mucous membrane. It's also easy to guess the occasions on which the child had his first experiences of the pleasure, which he is now striving to renew. It was the child's first and most vital activity, his sucking on his mother's breast, or at least substitutes for it that must have familiarized him with this pleasure, like a bottle. The child's lips, in our view, behave like an erotogenic zone. And no doubt, stimulation by the warm flow of milk is the cause of the pleasurable sensation. So to begin with, sexual activity attaches itself to functions serving the purpose of self-preservation, but does not become independent of them until later. And so that's the idea. So he says that these sexual drives emerge from instinctual activity, but it's when that instinctual activity that does serve a purpose sort of gets caught up with these excessive pleasures or this enjoyment, which is no longer, which sort of continues on its own and doesn't really need the original instinctual purpose it was based on. And this is just a quote from Tony Thwaites about the strangeness of this drive. So because the aim and object of the drive are always divergent from instinct, even if only minimally, it follows that drives cannot be satisfied in the way that bodily needs can. So that's why the sucking of the thumb never stops. It's not like the child will suck on his thumb until it's full and then stop. It's like, no, it's just this repetitive, insistent action. The drive's object is never quite this or that object in the world at all. Whatever actual object is offered to the drive will never satisfy it. There is something thoroughly phantasmatic about the object of the drive, which corresponds to no actual thing in the world, and remains after the actual object has been exhausted. And so that's his basic point of drives and sexuality. So these sexual drives emerge out of nature, but can't be reduced to biological needs. And this drive then is neither natural nor unnatural. It's actually showing up a point where nature sort of becomes inconsistent with itself, right? And this is a quote from Žižek about this discovery of Freud, and it sort of inverts the way most people think of Freudian psychoanalysis. So most people think Freudian psychoanalysis, that means everything is sex. Basically, you know, something's wrong. Yeah, you're having a dream about something. Yeah, it's just all sex, which is repressed. But in fact, Freud's point was that, in a way, the problem is that nothing is sexual. That sex itself is something that we don't just approach sex as sex. Sex itself is just the act of copulation is actually something that's quite unsexy when we think of the ways in which we, you know, our cultures frame sexuality. Sexuality is always caught up in all these other acts and rituals and so on that have nothing to do with the actual act of procreation. So his central point is actually there is no natural or pre-established place of human sexuality, that the latter is constitutively out of its place, fragmented or dispersed, and that it only exists in deviations from itself or its supposed natural object, and that sexuality is nothing other than this out-of-placeness of its constitutive satisfaction. It can neither be completely separated from biological organic needs and functions, since it originates with them, but it can't be reduced to them either. It's something other. So that's the first step in understanding this drive that emerges from nature, which now is neither natural nor unnatural. And we're going to pause there and take a 10-minute break. Yeah.
I don't know how to mute it. Hang on. Let's just try that. Still working. Still